Oh, did it tell you that it's recording? Great. Okay. So, again, thanks for being here. My name is Aya. I'm gonna briefly reintroduce the series and its organizers, and then I'll tell you a bit about what we're doing today. So the series on resistance in violent and repressive contexts started a few years ago as a way to share the work that was published in an edited volume by Johanna and Fouad, who are two of the series organizers. And then it sort of continued to become a platform to present, discuss, think together about the psychology of risky or costly descent in various forms across different geographies. And today we're starting the fourth round of the series. We'll continue to meet monthly. At the end of the session, I'll send you our schedule, and we hope to continue to see you. And yeah, I'll briefly reintroduce the organizers of the series. So they're Johanna Vollhardt at Clark University in the US, Fouad Bou Zeineddine at the University of Greenwich in the UK, Ali Teymoori at the University of Oslo in Norway, Canan, Coskan, who's an independent researcher with scientific affiliations to the Université Libre de Bruxelles and Bielefeld University, and myself, Adra. And I'm currently at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. And today, what we are hosting is a sort of methods bazaar. That's what we're calling it. The idea is to have a sort of interactive methods workshop where ourselves and hopefully some of you would share and swap knowledge, particularly about underutilized methods that have been or could be used to examine different forms of resistance. Sorry. Particularly forms of resistance that are understudied in the field in different contexts of violence and repression. So we'll start with the five of us doing a sort of 5-minute blitz presentation. Most of those, except for mine, will actually be giving an example of an underutilized research method. And then we've invited you to bring also a 5-minute presentation if you would like to. I'm sorry, I have to get the buzzer. They're being persistent. So essentially the order of things will be that we'll do our 5-minute presentations, and then we'll invite those of you that want to present to go ahead, and then we'll try to have like an open discussion. I was planning on going first, but since the buzzer is very annoying, maybe someone else can go first. I know that Ali and Johanna need to leave early. Ali, would you be okay with going ahead and then I'll take over?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and I will present. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay, great. So what I'm going to talk about is using qualitative observation method to study resistance. And what I'm going to argue that it's a more ecologically valid method of studying resistance, especially in a repressive and violent context. Why observation? So the key question would be what is the appropriate unit of analysis to study resistance? And looking at the literature on collective action and resistance, it seems that in a lot of the studies, the unit of analysis is individual. But then going back to the core elements of the sort of resistance concept or the original conceptualization of resistance, as proposed by Hollander and Einborner, has two important elements there's basically a consensus across diverse perspectives. One is it's an action, and the other one is it's an oppositional type of action. So if we take these two elements to be the core aspects of resistance, being an oppositional action means that it's basically happens in relation. And the conclusion would be that focusing on individual as the unit of analysis focuses mostly on intentions and mindset and may lack ecological validity. And therefore, the idea is that we might need a more ecologically valid method that takes into account both core elements of resistance, which are actions and being oppositional. Looking at the work in anthropology, and they've done a lot more work on this, and Frederick Barth, a very famous anthropologist, and recently wrote that the best way to understand social relation, especially in our case, the oppositional relation, hinge on the importance of observing the behavior of actors at the moment of action. So in that case, then we need to focus on the relationality of it, and we also need to basically find a natural setting in order to observe those actions. So I'm going to look at two perspectives that basically clarify this. One is the 9 dimensions of social setting by Spradley, and that's looking at the participant observation. And it has two different aspects. One is the dimensions of the action, and the other one, the descriptor. So what we need to focus on in order to use qualitative observation, we need to look at the space, the actor, the activity that they engage in, the objects. So it's not only the individuals, but we also need to see what objects there are in the setting, what acts they engage in, and what type of events do they take part, and what time basically they engage in that action, the goal of the action, and the feelings expressed by the actors at the moment of the action. So these are basically the 9 dimensions of the social setting that are extremely important to look into when we are looking at the the resistant acts. And I think the other advantage of using observation is that we can also look at it for a little bit of a longer period of time. And that's where the 8 main questions that Loveland, a main social theorist that use a lot of observations, talk about. So the 8 questions would look into the types, frequencies, magnitude, causes and consequences of the actions and the agencies involved. And at the same time, I think that's where also it's a very good method in order to understand the repression resistant dynamic, and that it also looks at the structure and the processes that basically may or may prevent engaging in a particular action. So these are the 2 aspects, the methodological aspects that I find it really interesting to study observation. And I'm going to present an example that an example of the study that we used some observational techniques. We did not follow as structurally as we had to, given that we didn't. Both of us who were writing the chapter were not present and we used an element of the observation method that is normally called an ethnographic method. That means you follow the unfolding of the event from distance by using all sorts of different materials. So what we find out is that the Women Life Freedom movement that basically unfolded in Iran, it was basically by looking at all of these dimensions that we talked about. And it's less organized, it's basically leaderless. It's very spontaneous. People suddenly come together in the middle of nowhere and start chanting. There's also an aspect of reclaiming a particular space, and despite being spontaneous and leaderless, is extremely cooperative given the amount of information that get transmitted. And there's also no specific ideology associated with that. And by looking at the type of object and acts and everything else that people get engaged in, we see that there's dramatic works of art that getting shared. And there's also from graphic designs, from graffitis, performances. Like in this case, you see a pond that is basically it's turned into red. You can see that there's no subject, but the object is basically quite symbolically important. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to do the final slides. Which is that why we need to use observation. So my argument would be that it shifts the unit of analysis to be opposition of relation, which is more ecologically valid and more consistent with the conceptualization. It helps tracking temporal unfolding and evolution of the resistance over time. It helps identify manifold basically forms of resistance, and also it helps with understanding the dynamics of repression and power. There are some references which we can share at the end into the list of important basically references in order to use these methods. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. Speaking of the references, I shared on the chat a link to a Google Doc. We were hoping to have a whiteboard running, but we had some technical issues. So this is a Google Doc for like collective note-taking. You can write in whatever you want, and then we'll add some references to it after the session. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm also going to time myself. This is a project that started a couple of years ago with a few collaborators where essentially we ran into a bunch of difficulties with trying to study everyday forms of resistance using sort of traditional interviews. And so I'll tell you a bit about these struggles. But before that, just very quickly, the motivation and sort of approach of the project is, as most of you will know, political and social psychologists have given priority to overt and organized forms of resistance, such as collective action, myself and a lot of the team members included. But scholars have recently advocated, well, not so recently, have advocated over time for broader conceptualizations of resistance, which incorporate everyday forms beyond organized action. And so this can include individual acts, this can include psychological resistance. There's sociological and psychological research on Arab youth, on women in South India, on peasants in Malaysia that show a sort of larger and more interesting repertoire of opposition to power that is not captured by collective action. And so the idea was that to equate the entirety of resistance with collective action, particularly in more repressive contexts where that might be more difficult to organize and do, is to potentially mistake a rich and complex tapestry of practices for something very narrow. And we realized that we lack an empirical understanding of what individuals themselves consider to be resistance in oppressive contexts, and the diverse, spontaneous, and sort of hidden actions that they may engage in to oppose power. And so we wanted to use a qualitative methodology. We wanted to use interviews and open-ended surveys, and to collect data from participants in Colombia, Hong Kong, Iran, Lebanon, and Turkey to try to investigate how people define resistance in repressive contexts and the sort of range of everyday practices that they may engage in that they consider resistance. And so we wanted to know first what's the range of practices to kind of create this repertoire, and then how dissidents themselves define or conceptualize resistance. And then we wanted to see if we could maybe do a typology to show the multifaceted nature of resistance. We were also interested, I won't speak about this much now, but we were also interested in exploring dimensions of power and of recognition. These are sort of scholarly debates in resistance. For it to be resistance, does the oppressor need to recognize it as power, as resistance, for example? And I'll just briefly tell you about some of the challenges that we faced. So while creating the interview guide, we were meeting with the local researchers from the different countries. And the first part of the interview was meant to capture the practices, and then the second part of the interview was meant to capture conceptualizations. So first we wanted to know what people do that they consider resistance, and then how they define resistance themselves. And we went back and forth a lot. If we were interested in people defining resistance, do we actually provide them with a scholarly definition or not? And we ended up choosing not to say we define resistance as such and such. What do you engage in that you consider resistance? Precisely because the second part of the interview was meant to capture what people think of as resistance, so we didn't want to bias them or anchor them. So then the question became something like, can you tell me some of the things that you do that you consider resistance? And in some of the interviews, for example, people talk about advocating for themselves in the context of the family, which by all means may be opposition to power, but that's not really what we were interested in. And this relates also to a translational issue that we face, which is both linguistic and has to do with the political context. So first, when it comes to linguistics, we were dealing with 5 languages: Arabic, Cantonese, Turkish, Farsi, and Spanish. And there were no direct translations of the word resistance that mean what we think they mean in all of these languages. So just like from a linguistic perspective, that was difficult. But then also the political context matters. So in Lebanon, for example, the word muqawama, which means resistance, is very intimately linked to a particular political party, but also to the idea of resisting Israel. So in previous work, I had used the words political labor, العمل السياسي, to talk about resistance. But here, because we were trying to do something comparative, we wanted to use as much as possible the same words. In the context of Hong Kong, for example, our collaborator thought that it would be a terrible idea to use the direct translation of the word resistance in Cantonese, because being such a repressive context, the word resistance in Cantonese sounds extremely radical. It's not something that even activists would want to associate themselves with. And so he had suggested that we use something like political participation or civic engagement. But then if you get answers that have to do with volunteering at the local organization, because we're talking about civic engagement, that's not exactly what we were looking for. So there was a range of linguistic issues that we had to deal with. And then just one last example of like the struggles of this project. We also really wanted to capture inaction. So there's been work on, for example, tax evasion as an action, as resistance, or there's also work on mothers in Northern Ireland that refuse to speak to the police during raids as a form of resistance. So we wanted to try to see whether participants do any sort of inaction that they consider resistance. But the question is there anything you have not done, refused to do, or stopped doing that you consider resistance? And when listening to some of these interviews, it's pretty clear that we did not find a way to ask this question to capture what we wanted to ask. And we chose not to give examples because, again, we didn't want to bias participants by saying, have you ever not voted to resist? Have you ever not paid your taxes to resist? And so I think we kind of failed to be able to capture that in this part of the survey. I will stop here. So this is ongoing work that we continue to struggle with. So we would be very happy to hear thoughts. But I think it's also a very good precursor to some of the other methods that folks here will be presenting to kind of avoid a lot of these issues with more traditional interview methods. Okay, Johanna, would you like to go next?
I can. I'm just wondering if we should also see if there are any questions before we move on to the next one. I forget what we discussed if we'll do it all, but it might be difficult to remember everything, right?
Sure, yeah, this is a good time to pause if anyone has thoughts, feelings, questions. I can see there's some note-taking happening.
Yeah, I mean, if not, we can also, of course, get back to it later. I just thought after each presentation, if there's any immediate clarification, we can pause.
Sure, that also applies to Ali's because I went right ahead, so we can also go back.
I mean, we were still rattled by whoever that person was, so apologies to everyone.
Yeah.
We'll need to go back and check his registration, what he entered there.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, if there are no questions, I'll just go ahead and we can get back to it.
Johanna, I'll raise my hand when you have a minute left. Like my virtual hand.
Yes. Yeah, because it is 7 a.m. and I did not yet have my coffee, so we'll see how it goes. So this is, sorry, I didn't prepare slides specifically for this, so I'll just show you something from a previous presentation just to show you the method, and the article that I'm drawing on is here in this link. It's open access. I'll put it in the document also later. But basically, my method follows up on Aya's point about complexity of resistance, which is, I think, a challenge, a theoretical challenge, and also an empirical one that all of us have dealt with. We've been discussing a lot in this series. Simply the issue that people don't just resist in one way. There are multiple tactics. It changes dynamically over time. And also people have complex ideas about resistance that could involve what they themselves would do, how they perceive other people's tactics, the combination of different dimensions of resistance, disruption, violence, nonviolence, etc., that can pair with various other forms of resistance. So it's actually quite challenging to capture what people do if we want to do it comprehensively. If we use conventional methods like surveys, and then try to analyze it with our ordinary statistics. So we had a similar issue in studying how people think about collective victimization. So that's the study I'm drawing from here. And just to show you briefly, so when we tried to map out all the different possible dimensions and ways in which people think about collective victimization, we get something like this, and these are just the overarching categories. And within that, there are, 5 or 10 items within each that would be really important to assess if we want to get a more comprehensive view of what people are thinking about and how also different dimensions might combine with other ones in different ways, giving rise to a very different meaning then of the particular item. So to make that abstract statement more concrete, if we think about inclusive victimization beliefs, for example, whether you see similarities with other groups' experiences, that will play out very differently. If someone claims that or agrees to that, it can mean something very different if they are, for example, also acknowledging their group's power and privilege or ignoring their group's power and privilege, using the inclusive comparison in more strategic ways. So that's just one example of how when we look at each of these forms in combination, it might actually mean something different. And similarly, for resistance, the complexities and interactions between different forms of resistance, different dimensions and also levels and layers, perceived norms, what you yourself do, etc., might give rise to a more complex picture. So in order to capture that, finally getting to the method, we used Q methodology, which I haven't used yet specifically for studies on resistance, although we do have one on collective victimization that brings in, or all of our studies bring in some aspects of resistance as well. But Q methodology is an old method. It's from the 50s. It's been underutilized in psychology, although some people like Christopher Kors, for example, and Melis Uluk have been using the method as well in social psychology. It's basically like a factor analysis where you analyze people rather than items by looking at the sorting pattern for a big number of statements that they fill out about a given issue. So what you try to do is compile a list of all of the different possible ideas people could have about the phenomenon of interest. So not as we do in survey research where we have to force ourselves to choose just a few that are most relevant, etc. Here, the aim is to really maximize and to get a comprehensive set of statements, all the different possible ways that people could be thinking about this particular issue, such as resistance, let's say. So then you have between 50 or 80 or sometimes even more statements that people read through and first pre-sort, just generally saying in a pre-sorting session if they generally agree or disagree or how well that reflects how they think about the issue. And there's also a neutral midpoint. And then in the next rounds, they sort it into this quasi normal distribution, which again, it's a simple, I agree with this most, I agree with this least. Spectrum, like in any survey, but they are doing this with all of the statements in relation to each other so that they can say this particular idea about resistance matches a little bit more closely how I think about the issue than this. And then they sort this into this pattern until they like how it represents their views on the issue. And then the unit of analysis is people's sorting pattern into this quasi-normal distribution. So how they are sorting all statements in relation to each other. Okay, one more minute. It's a small n approach, meaning you're not aiming for a huge representative sample. You're instead doing purposive sampling because the idea of this methodology is also to capture shared viewpoints that differ within a community. So we're interested in shared viewpoints if we can find people who sort these statements in a similar way, giving rise to a similar pattern. But then within a community, are there a few different ways in which this occurs that are typical? So we're looking for the shared viewpoints, not just the individual ones, or actually not at all the individual ones, but just the ones that are consistent, similar across a few different people. And then the purpose of sampling allows us to see if there are if it's patterned in any way. For example, are leftists agreeing with this more than are religious people agreeing with this more, their gender, class differences, things like that. So we can interpret then the patterns also through the lens of demographic intersecting identities and backgrounds. It's analyzed with there's open source software to analyze it. It's analyzed similarly to factor analysis, essentially. But then you take also what they say about their sorting patterns as additional qualitative information to help interpret these patterns that are, of course, quite complex because you have to look at all 60 statements, where they fall, how they were ranked, and kind of put together a coherent narrative about that pattern. Last thing I'll say is typically this gives rise to 2 to 5 different viewpoints. So you end up having, this is just from our study, an example. You end up having kind of a cluster of a few different viewpoints for each community that are shared between a few different people. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Johanna. Any immediate reflections or questions? Okay. Well, if not, I can already see some questions written in the document, but maybe we can circle back to these then. Okay, should we have Fouad and then Canan? Fouad, I'll also raise my hand when you have a minute.
Hi, everybody. So today I'm going to talk a bit about mostly computational network methods and sort of some opportunities in that direction. Just one moment, I need to share. Okay, can you see my screen okay? All right. So yeah, there's a ton of underutilized publicly available data sources that we just don't typically use as much as we could. This can be text, all sorts of text that we can leverage, not just sort of social media text, but also things like open-ended survey responses, events data. There's been a few massive leaks of administrative or diplomatic communication, investigative sort of databases that can be analyzed usefully. There's images like satellite imagery. Recently, a group in Harvard, I think, used satellite imagery to analyze sort of targeting of healthcare and things like this in Gaza, for example, to sort of determine that there is a deliberate targeting of that. But also sound and videos can be analyzed using some new sort of encoder or transformer methods. There's different functions for computational methods, and it can be either directed or undirected. So it can be inductive from the data, or you can sort of bring in a particular frame and sort of direction. And it can help us label things, detect things, predict things. There's all sorts of different uses for all of these functions. The question, though, then is how can we use this in a way that isn't super universalizing and colonial? But there are people who have been thinking about how to use computational network methods in more critical ways and for more critical purposes, whether that's for diagnosing social problems, formalizing theory in ways that are we don't typically do in as much specificity as when you do when you have to sort of specify parameters for models. It can demonstrate the limits of certain interventions and call new attention to old problems. And it also, I think for me, most interestingly, is it allows us to integrate across levels of analysis over time and allows us to have these more ecologically valid dynamic systems analysis approaches. And it's a varied and flexible toolbox. It can combine various things, whether this is the traditional methods we use, but also all of these other sort of computational and network and agent-based methods. And these different methods can be combined together through what's called an analytic pipeline. And in the pipeline design, there's so many possible combinations for so many possible purposes that really it's a huge area for creative and generative research. So the combinations of these methods can be better used together than apart. And something that I think is under-recognized is that these methods are often mixed method, and in fact, best used when they are mixed method. For example, an example pipeline here that Simon Angus gave us, and we have a tool to do this, to build these type pipelines actually for research in social science and specifically for social change that Simon developed for us in our methods workshop series. I'll put the link in the chat soon. That is freely available and you can use it for building these kinds of pipelines. But in any case, with a typical or an example pipeline, you're coding training data. This can be using synthetic data, or you can code qualitatively available data. Then you vectorize, so you're recoding the text into numerical vectors based on your qualitative code or synthetic data. Then you're clustering and visualizing to identifying patterns in label codes or representing it in 2 dimensions. Then you're training logistic classifiers to predict future data based on this. Then you're evaluating the performance against new data. And then this allows you perhaps to predict labels or classification or discourses over time from incoming text data that has never been used before or never been seen before. And there's some really interesting examples that we've seen throughout our workshop series that runs in parallel to this one, which we also have on our archive site. So, for example, Agnieszka Rychwalska presented on a connectionist network model of dynamic identities, where she shows identities or conceptualizes identities as intermittent, reoccurring co-activation of specific meanings, where the activation flows through the network of identity meanings in the presence of specific social contacts over time. And she shows that this is sensitive to audience composition and feedback, which activates certain meanings or appropriate identity performance. And this work was conducted through a mix of qualitative and quantitative coding of forum threads, and showed that the knowledge and function of this functions in these fora are coded in the structure and interaction mechanism of a neural network. A different example here is Kevin's Durheim and colleagues' work on speaker landscapes and polarization detection. So they built pipelines to establish sort of self-organization of certain topics on social media. So they found that people who were more linguistically similar, saying similar things, were clustering in a way that allowed better detection of polarization than looking at, for example, who was interacting with who. And as well, they were able to use this kind of pipeline to look at group polarization through the combination of looking at networks and language and interaction and language dynamics. I did some work as well using a pipeline along these lines, looking at Moroccan and Egyptian historical memories, where I used a latent classifier based on a qualitative coding of open-ended survey responses. Then I used a logistic regression to predict that class membership from traditional political scale measures like system justification or political engagement. And the latent class analysis showed that the population generally split into those who were more concerned about foundational history and those who were more concerned about modern history. And what we were able to find was that Moroccans who were sort of more, were recalling more foundational history showed higher system justification, but that was not the case for Egyptians. And sort of the conclusion that we came to from this and other findings in this paper was that history was used very differently by the political elites and socialization mechanisms in these two countries for legitimation and mobilization or demobilization processes in these two countries. I think, so yeah, so I mean, using this toolbox critically is vital because it can be used in very biased and bad ways. And Joshua Oihang, another one of our speakers in our workshops, has been thinking quite a lot about this, has published about this, thinking about what it means to be critical when it comes to using these methods, and really is about thinking about these quantitative aspects of these methods in terms of apprehending the constraining social structure of meaning, and qualitative methods in order to engage reflexively with the fluid construction of that meaning within the structures, and using both to create insight at the same time. And I have some references here that I'll share with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Fouad.
Sorry about that. I didn't notice the raised hand. Sorry.
So we have one more presentation coming up by Canan before we move to the audience, but just a quick pause in case someone has thoughts, feelings, questions. All right, Canan, you can share your screen, and I'll also raise my hand.
Thank you.
When you're
Thanks,
over time.
Aya. Okay. Do you see my slides now? Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is more of an analysis intervention rather than data collection intervention. And my focal point was on power rather than resistance, but those two have always been connected. So that's why it's part of the resistance series as well. The main focus was understanding how Kurds in diaspora make sense of their community, collective, and individual power, as well as the dynamics of oppression and resistance. So this was a project in which I wanted to make the community-centered research practices available to the community itself. And also I wanted to support the resistance in the diaspora groups. What I tried to do was to combine interviews with another analytical methodology. So it's about connecting reflexive thematic analysis with participatory action research. And why is this important? Because because of multi-layered resistance. That means that we have social movements that are generally more visible in terms of the manifestations of resistance, right? But we have also individuals, families, small groups, parties. We know from different forms of resistance happening in
Can others still hear Canan? Okay. I guess there's an internet issue because I also can't see Canan.
I think she's frozen.
Yeah. I can remove the sharing and see. We are really not having a smooth session here. Apologies. All right, I guess we can give it a minute and see if Canan comes back and can continue the presentation. And maybe in the meantime, I can ask, is anyone here planning on doing an intervention from your side on methods, which we had? Yeah, I see Stuffy's hand. Cool. Anyone else? Maybe you can raise also like digital hands. Not Stuffy, I saw you, but if anyone else. Okay, great. So I guess after Canan, we'll have Stuffy and then we'll try to have a larger just conversation. Fouad, could you also add the links you're adding to the Google Doc, maybe?
Of course.
Thanks. In the meantime, if anyone has thoughts or questions, particularly for Ali and Johanna, because I think they have to leave soonish, feel free to do so.
I had a question. If my name is Mallet. I'm a research psychologist at Michigan State in the United States. I study racism, and first, I'm just incredibly grateful that I found the link to this. This has been really exciting, and I've learned a lot from everyone. I was just curious for Professor Teymoori if would be willing to maybe describe a little bit more about what you meant in relation to the idea that an ecological approach is more valid as opposed to other approaches. Love to hear more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think with the unit of analysis and ecological validity, there are basically two different points that I basically put it together in the presentation for the sake of time. So one was that observation might be actually a better way to study resistance, given that it's better able to capture the two constitutive elements that basically a lot of conceptualizations have consensus on. That was the being oppositional and being on action. And a lot of the cases when we ask people, they might actually have some intentions, but it doesn't get realized in reality, or even some of them might engage in an activity that they would not basically, they might engage in an activity that there's no intention of being oppositional, but in reality it turns oppositional. So I think in that way, then observation might be a much better approach to study this, and it might. And the other issue is that using observation, we look into the natural setting that it takes place. I think the way we've been looking at least in the psychological literature, when they look at the people's attitude toward different collective actions, they talk about mostly in terms of attitudes, and only as a limitation, and in a lot of the cases on apologetic tone that we didn't look into the behavior, but there's a discrepancy between attitudes and behavior. So that has been only a concern also with the studies that take only the measurement as people's opinions or intention to support, intention to join, but no longer look at the action. And I think on that regard, it's more ecologically valid because it takes an action that has taken place. And it's all people engage already in that behavior. And it also takes into account that it's quite dynamic. It's relational. It's in opposition to something. It doesn't happen only in the... So that's something that what I meant with the ecologically being valid. But actually, it's just 2 points. One is that conceptually is more consistent to use observation, given that it's oppositional action, and the other one, it's basically more ecologically valid because it takes the natural setting that the action takes place.
Thank you. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you, Ali. Canan, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm in Istanbul and we're having some electricity cuts, so sorry. I will reshare my screen.
Yeah.
I don't know where you have been left out totally, but I will start. I won't start over. It's just I was talking about the multi-layered resistance, and yeah. I hope that was clear. Okay, perfect. So.
Go on again, right? It's not me.
The participatory action research. So what I tried to.
Now it's working. Sorry, you glitched for a second.
Okay, that's it. If you lose me again, I'm really sorry about it, and I will try my best to make it quick. So I did in-depth semi-structured interviews. It's a purposive sampling. Not much details for now. We can talk later, but I started to apply the reflexive thematic analysis once I was done with the interviews. But I didn't complete the analysis. On the 9th or 10th interview, I don't remember exactly, but it should be 10th, I stopped the analysis. I stopped the coding and looked at the general codes, tried to come up with a vague structuring of categories and codes into sub-themes and themes. And why I did do that? Because I didn't want to do the reflexive thematic analysis on my own, at least not per se. What I did was to bring those preliminary analysis back to the participants. For that, I organized focus groups. This is a kind of participatory action research, but here action is the analysis itself. So I collected 50 codes from my preliminary analysis, and I provided those quotations to the workshop participants for 5 people in one workshop, and I provided them all of those quotations. I asked them to code those. And that was meant, first of all, to dismantle the researcher-participant power asymmetry, to support the community's collective agency and induce the collective reflexivity about our understandings of power and resistance within the community. And that also was to enhance my own reflexivity, rethinking my own positionality in a group environment, in an active group environment. And it also serves to consolidate or challenge the preliminary analysis that I've done. And it has also a purpose for more member checking, to be honest. And as I said, I could include 3 to 5 participants in each group. So it wouldn't work out well in large groups. Like a group of 10, it would be difficult. That's because, okay, so this was my first preliminary coding and vague themes before doing the workshops, the participatory action research. And first of all, I prepared the quotations. I instructed the workshop participants about the aim of the research and explained the collective task. So we would focus first individually on the quotations and try to put some words, meanings into those quotations on our own. And then we will gather up and start to discuss what kind of meanings we have attributed to those quotations of the interviews. And we tried the first and second code together, and then people were in their own corner trying to code things. If they were bored, we were getting back to the collective discussions, etc., and then getting back to the individual corners. But a total 3 to 5 participants first individually coded those. But this wasn't very like a systematic coding that we do in reflexive thematic analysis. I just asked them, please write whatever comes up first to your mind when you read this quotation. So that was that simple as it is. And then we started to discuss all of those meanings, why we have attributed those meanings, and why that specific participant, that anonymized participant, might have talked about that issue, the quotations relations, the person's relations to the quotation in terms of their own sociopolitical and individual positionalities, etc. So that was whole a reflexive exercise in a group format, I would say. And we get to code the data together as well. And on the third step, I presented this preliminary visualization of the codes. And the workshop participants started to criticize my visualization, my naming of the codes, of the sub-themes, etc. And as I finished the third workshop with the participants, the third participatory analysis, let's say, I could develop a more complex picture of the themes and sub-themes. Some of the codes have shifted the meanings. For instance, the Turkish violence that now you see under "we see you, you deny to see us." it was under being here, feeling there theme. But it changed the theme because the participants making sense of the Turkish violence in that given context. So it helped me to change the analysis throughout. Okay, I'm coming to an end. Overall, it helped me to consolidate and change the analysis, but it also helped the participants to make sense of the data analysis, of the research, and directly contribute to the knowledge production so that it creates an epistemic justice to an extent. I will stop here. We can talk more as you have questions, and thanks.
Thank you so much, Johanna. All right. Okay. So, if there are any immediate questions, happy to take them. And if not, there's at least a couple of people that would like to intervene. I think Steffi and Anna. And if other folks decide to join, by all means. I'll also apply the 5-minute rule to you all, so I'll raise my hand when you're out of time. I'll raise my hand when you're 1 minute away from time. All right. Steffi, do you want to go? Do you have slides to share, or you're just speaking?
Sure. Yeah, I was going to informally share. I have a slide which I can show maybe at the end.
Great, sure.
Yeah, so I was just going to share my experience working with interviews. I get the feeling that lots of people in this group are using interviews. I normally use Bradney's ethnographic interviews, but I also use just available interviews on the media because sometimes it's too dangerous to enter resistance contexts. And basically, when I look at the methodology that is available for studying interviews, I immediately some very famous methods such as thematic analysis, which we've seen, then content analysis, then we have discourse analysis, we also have narrative analysis. And it never really helps with my own endeavor, which is to identify reasoning processes by which ordinary people make decisions to engage in resistance behavior. So what I did was to look around, go shopping for methods that could help me find something appropriate. And I came across this methodology that's called cognitive mapping. And basically what it allows me to do is to systematically code interview data into the reasoning processes by which my interviewees, participants in resistance behavior, describe how they made decisions to do all sorts of behaviors, really. So I think we've heard that there are a lot of varieties of resistance behaviors. I won't go into the detail here. The main point here is that cognitive mapping allows me to code the interview data into reasoning processes that show how people make decisions to become active. Now, how does this work? Basically, in cognitive mapping, we go sentence by sentence. It's very time consuming. And we code literally every sentence for the specific factors that the interviewee expresses when discussing their resistance behavior. And in addition, we also look at linguistic connectors such as because, then, or if, because, therefore, or if then, in order to see how the interviewees connect these different factors that they mention. So, for example, if we think about a sentence from an interviewee who says, I felt very afraid because the police was starting to beat up the protesters. In cognitive mapping, we would code this sentence into two factors, feeling afraid and the police beating up the protesters. And then we would have a causal connector because, which shows that the fear is based, or feelings of fear are based on the police beating up the protesters. Now, if we do this for the entire interview, we end up with very detailed maps. And I have an example here, which I can share. So this is actually just an excerpt of a map on the top right. And these maps give us fine-grained information about the psychology underlying decisions to engage in resistance. In this case, it's an individual that decided to engage in violent resistance, but we could think of any kind of resistance, as I said earlier. On the bottom of the slide, you see some examples of how I identified connections. And basically, what this method helps us is to complement existing theories on resistance behavior. So one of the key findings from a research on the Arab Spring, for example, was that when applying the cognitive mapping approach, we see that rather than negative emotions like anger, it's positive emotions like hope, courage, or solidarity, which were themselves triggered by observing protests at home or revolutions abroad, that motivated individuals to mobilize. I have other examples, but I will shut up now. There's an article forthcoming in Qualitative Psychology, which I would be happy to share once it's out, which elaborates on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You were also fantastic last time. I was about to give you the raising hand. Thanks so much. Does anyone have any immediate questions, or do we move to Anna? All right, Anna, the floor is yours, and I will let you know when you have 1 minute left.
I think as I haven't prepared something, it'll probably be shorter, but I thought it's an interesting tool to throw it out here. It's called daily diaries or experience sampling or ecological momentary assessment. They're slightly different, but they all kind of refer to the same set of methods of asking participants kind of on a daily basis or multiple times a day what they're doing, how they're feeling. And I think this could be a really nice tool that hasn't been used yet to study everyday resistance, as we're really interested in like this everyday dynamics, what people do on a everyday daily life basis. And instead of kind of abstracting vaguely what do I regularly do, what have I done in the past year, we ask them every day what they're doing. And also like this has a big tradition in emotions and affective research. So I think it also is a good tool to tap into the temporal dynamics of emotions. Maybe there's anger on certain days while there's a protest wave, and on other days there's low anger, and we usually kind of average them when we ask people in cross-sectional surveys. And yeah, it does allow kind of very fine-grained within-person differences, and it has been reduced mostly as a quantitative tool, but it does have the possibility to allow for kind of qualitative inputs, and then people describing which context they did certain actions, why they did this, how they felt in their own words. I'll share, maybe this is an interesting article for you to put in the chat. Yeah, it has been studied a bit with the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. That's the paper that I'll link you. But I think it hasn't been explored that much as a tool to really come closer to people like activists, defenders, people doing resistance every day's life. Not sure. I'm happy to kind of speak more about it, but I think just throwing it out there as a way of doing surveys, but doing it in a way that are maybe more meaningful for people. And there's a big debate of making also the analysis immediately visible to the people after they've completed like the 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 10 days series of surveys, that they get some individual feedback on how is my well-being, how is my distress. Yeah, if you just copy it like this, I think here it should be just working now. Yeah, I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, would anyone else like to share thoughts on research they've used or have looked into, not necessarily used, or have heard about that may be relevant but was not shared today?
Or also ask questions like methodological conundrums you have run into. That's another possibility.
Yeah. There's also some questions I see in the Google Doc. It's a lot of information.
I'll just add one question or one observation also. I think one challenge that we have been running to, we meaning my graduate students and I, when we think about some forms of resistance that are less articulated as such, Ali mentioned that before, or more covert, right, where people have obvious good reasons to conceal it or maybe do not necessarily articulate it as resistance themselves. It's just hard to capture with these kinds of methodologies, right? So I think, except for Ali's method, I think all of the ones that we talked about require really a lot of reflection and articulation on the side of participants and their willingness to disclose information, right? So that's a challenge that we just keep running into. If we are interested in studying everyday resistance, more covert, more subtle forms of resistance, how do we do it, right? So I don't know if anyone has any kinds of methodologies that speak to that they could talk about a bit, or how they've gone about doing it.
Yeah, maybe I would add to that an extra complication is also if we're taking seriously the idea that resistance is broader than what we've been used to capturing, and that expands to contexts in which people are practicing opposition to power in ways that they don't recognize as resistance, that they don't name resistance. It's like we had these discussions for 2 years. It feels at least virtually impossible. Maybe there are methods we're missing to try to capture that. Because it feels like then you're stuck between two options. Either you do something like interviews or surveys or whatever, and you take at face validity what people are saying, or you do something like observation and you impose your own definition of resistance on what people are doing, kind of add this layer, the scholarly layer. And I think in between these two, we haven't been able to find a space to kind of let things be what they are, but capture still the complexity.
I mean, I think your study, if I understood correctly, I was a little distracted trying to make my coffee. If I understood correctly, that's what your study also did a little bit and got at, right? That we don't use the word, and we've played a little bit with that in our interviews as well, right? That we, for example, give people a scenario or describe a situation and just ask people like, what do you do in that situation to, I forget how we worded it. I don't think we said like challenge or undermine that issue, but we use some kind of synonyms, right? Like just using different ways to describe action and opposition, which is the basic definition of resistance, but in ways that are in words that are not so ideologically laden with meaning and connotations and potentially risky for people, kind of more lay terminology. So I think your study helps with that as well, right? To get at the lexicon of words, terms that people use in those, and it's very context specific, of course, so that we can then use it in studies to ask about what people do without labeling it resistance. But that's just one thought.
Mm-hmm.
I think also just perhaps broadening sort of the object of study beyond language. So there's just a lot of like behavior and a lot of social organization that is quite telling about sort of what people are thinking, what people are doing in ways that they might not necessarily be open about in language. So the sort of the example that I used earlier about the satellite imagery, that kind of thing is very helpful and useful. Like I know also Kevin did a study looking at like where beachgoers go on the beach to look at segregation and prejudice dynamics, for example, in South Africa. I mean, these kinds of things require us, I think, to be a bit more creative. But if we're able to sort of specify certain behaviors, certain interaction partners, I've been thinking, for example, about looking at sort of politician meeting events. So who's meeting who, based on just news sources and things like this, and simply create an interaction network for these to look at coalitional dynamics, and sort of connect that to, for example, public opinion data and trends in that. I think this might not be this might not have been applied so much to things like everyday resistance, but there's no reason it can't be, I think.
There's a question in the doc by Mallet. Do you want me to read? I think it's for me. Do you want me to read it or do you want to reformulate it?
I can probably reformulate it. I think I was just maybe I misunderstood what you were saying, but my memory is that you were sharing that your participants were providing definitions, actions, perspectives around resistance that differed from sort of a more academic or scholarly perspective around what resistance is. And I wonder if you had thoughts that um, about it sounded like you were maybe questioning the validity of their perspectives of resistance in comparison to the validity of our sort of perspectives around resistance. And I wonder if my interpretation of that was accurate. And I wonder if you have an overall thought about why their perspectives might be different around resistance in relation to perhaps their positionality or class oppression or whatever it is. I was just curious for your perspectives on that.
Yeah, no, it's great that you asked that. So I think the logic of the study was kind of the opposite. It was to be critical about scholarly definitions of resistance, which there's quite a large literature in which scholars are debating the sort of dimensions that need to be present for us to call something resistance. There's these debates around should the person acknowledge that it's resistance? Should the oppressor acknowledge that it's resistance? If you do something and the oppressor doesn't think of it as resistance, should we call it resistance? There's this weird sort of cult-like academic conversation that's very enclosed, in which we're trying to agree on, or have some consensus on what constitutes resistance. And the logic of this project is, well, probably the definitions that matter are those of the people engaging in resistance. So we were trying to kind of put all of that aside and then go ask folks, what do you think of as resistance? But really the methodological challenge was that asking people, what do you think of as resistance, particularly when you're doing it in different languages and different contexts, without saying anything about what resistance means, proves to be quite challenging. So you ask someone, what do you think of as resistance? But you don't say anything about what you think resistance is because you don't want to bias the participant. Then resistance can be understood in all sorts of ways beyond politics, for example. And so I don't think we quite figured out. We ended up adding a probe right after. So we say, what actions do you do that you consider to be resistance? And then we say something like, we're thinking of things beyond protest or going to demonstrations, to kind of prime people in the direction of politics. Like, but we don't mean going to a protest. Is there anything else? But I think we still have the feeling, all of us on the team, that we haven't found the right way to get the actual breadth of answers that I am certain exists. I don't know that people would have thought of saying, I wear a certain wristband that, represents confrontation to authority. I don't know that our questions opened the door to these kinds of answers.
That makes a ton of sense. Thank you. Sorry for misunderstanding where you were coming from on that. It's a little early here. I'm not sure what it was, but yeah, that makes a bunch of sense. Thanks.
Maybe I would also add that this is really a methods workshop. I don't know if that counts as methods, but there's also a ton of logistical issues that come with all of this research. So for us, for example, ethics approvals were a nightmare, particularly at European institutions. Like, they were scared for us, the research. Well, like, these are our countries. We're embedded in these networks. That was a mess. Questions around security, like if you want to do some of these things online, what software to choose, how to encrypt your data, how to store your data, things around compensation. we're asking for people's time who might be in precarious positions. We do want to compensate them. They deserve this as labor. At the same time, we want to make sure the compensation is not coercion. So we want to find the right amount so that people are compensated, but they don't feel pressure to do this. Like there's a whole range of logistical issues, I guess, are broadly methodological that come also with trying to set up these studies. I don't know if anyone has experience figuring these things out. Those are also tough.
Yeah, maybe an additional difficulty there was also for me in compensation. What is fair if you do research with participants in different cultural contexts? Do you adjust what you pay, but then is it worse? Like, is some people's time less worse than others just because in their national currency, this is a month of salary versus in where you are, this is their like hourly wage. And this is so difficult ethical questions. I think it's good that we kind of name them here, even though we don't have the answers.
Yes, or sometimes you're also not allowed to offer any compensation. I'm currently working on Hezbollah, for example, and I was told that I'm not allowed to even invite them for a cup of coffee because then we will have legal problems. So I think it's a really, really important issue that we cannot support each other enough with if anyone is going through an application.
Yeah, and I guess this is going to get worse and worse as more of groups resisting are getting conscripted as terrorist organizations and prescribed organizations and stuff. Like so many of the folks we would like to speak to because they're leading this work are now branded as people we're not allowed to speak to institutionally. Yeah, I don't know how this is, but for example, in the UK right now, can you do a research project working with folks from Palestine Action, or would your university be like, no way, we're not touching that subject?
I guess I could maybe speak a little bit on that. I'm from the UK at the University of Oxford, where Palestine Action groups have been very looked down on, specifically within the institution. If I were to apply for ethical approval for an original data set where I had to collect data and speak to people who were involved in the occupation and encampment of the university, I do not see that ever being approved. I don't think that that would happen. Maybe I'm biased, but from within the institution, I think it would be incredibly difficult. It would be something maybe you could do non-academically, engaging with that research with an NGO, but to have the university affiliation, of course, is something very different. And to conduct a study from the university, unfortunately, does mean something different, and I don't see it necessarily being possible.
Yeah, thanks, Elena. Anna?
Yes, I'm sorry for not having my camera on, but Elena, I completely understand the setting, and I was wondering if in the UK, for example, if you were to collaborate in a place where the ethics committee would approve it and you would be a co-researcher, would it be possible for you to conduct that research? Or your university, even if you're a co-researcher, has to approve that project, for example, because those could be other ways of doing so, solidarity and allowing others to do research, but I don't know if that's possible in different contexts.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, it's going to differ very much depending on where you are in your career progression. So right now I'm still a master's student. I don't necessarily have access to conduct my own research that is not approved by the university. If I were a lecturer, professor, someone who had their own research group and research stipend, then maybe very different. I could engage with projects outside of my purview. But you're right, there's still, of course, collaboration with people outside of institutions and then bringing in your institutional backing. I do wonder to what extent there is that control over what you do by the place that I don't want to say owns you, but it does sometimes feel like that. I don't know if other people agree or disagree, but it's an interesting question. I wonder, I could speak to some of the more progressed colleagues here and see maybe next time I can update you.
Johanna, you have your virtual hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to add one method also to consider. I think this was mentioned before, given the ethical complications, practical implications, is simply using existing oral histories, oral testimonies. So I'm going to put in the chat a very long thing from my syllabus, actually, because I use this a lot in my teaching, and I'll put it in the document as well. Oh, it won't let me send. Okay. Anyway, so there are a number of databases. Sorry, let me see if this now it will send. Okay, abbreviated version. I'll put it in the document. These are just a few examples, but there are out there databases with oral testimonies from survivors who lived through genocide, wars, occupations, etc., from a number of different contexts. These are just a few. There are other databases like that. I've been using that in my research on Holocaust resistance among Jewish Holocaust survivors because, obviously in a context of genocide, you can't conduct a study on ongoing resistance. So using these interviews in the aftermath, which creates, of course, new methodological challenges about interpretation, etc. But it is a lot of really rich information, and I've really, I don't know if enjoyed is the right word, but it's been very rewarding and meaningful to work with these oral testimonies in my own research, and I use them for teaching as well. One caveat is, and so you can use these, right, without ethics approval, actually, because it has already been released for public use. Of course, one obvious caveat, both ethically and methodologically, is, and I tell my students, like, don't mess with testimonies from contexts that you don't understand, right? So I do kind of require them to work on contexts where they actually have at least some understanding of the background to interpret, or, for us, we can always collaborate with researchers from those contexts. But that's another method recommendation for researching resistance in some of the most violent contexts in the aftermath.
And I mean, the recommendation to only mess with data sets where you know the context applies to a new data collection, right?
Yes, absolutely, all of this. But with this, it's just so tempting, right? Because the data is out there and you can take it and analyze it. So I think it's particularly,
yeah. And maybe another thing this relates to is the fact that all of this research, as well-intentioned as when you're collecting data, as well-intentioned as it is, ends up either not just being extractivist kind of by nature, right? You end up asking for people's time, and I don't know that we've collectively found ways to translate whatever comes out of our research into something useful to give back to folks that have given us our time. Okay, I'm checking to see if I missed any questions. So I'm not on Zoom right now. I will not be able to see you guys in a second. Feel free to unmute yourself and speak. Just checking if I missed anything. Okay, I don't think so. Any last thoughts? No, we could close this up. Actually, very good on time.
There's a question in the chat that says, it's from Aisha. I will read it unless the person would like to read it themselves.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I missed that. Would you like to, or should I read the question?
I can read it quickly. It just asks, as an early scholar, well, thank you for the conversation, learning so much. As an early scholar, I'm thinking a lot about positionality. And I'm curious if any of you have thoughts or advice on how to navigate trust when you are analyzing resistance through institutions, as institutions can be very extractive and are viewed that way, potentially by the people that you're studying, I assume.
Great question.
Personally, I don't think I've found a solution for this. I mean, resistance or not, this is an issue for anybody who has issues around sort of your institutional affiliation or doing research through institutions or even just doing research. in many places is suspicious and weird. But I remember, like, when I was in Austria and trying to study the far right identitarian movement there, as soon as they heard I was working with a university, basically just shut me out. And I tried to do this through sort of students, proxies, maybe it was my race, but really it was just about the fact that we were sort of university. This was university research.
And for a lot of us, we're based at institutions outside of our home countries, in countries that are particularly perceived suspiciously for a very good reason back home. So there's also this dynamic of representing an institution from a country, and then coming and asking folks questions. They have every right to be suspicious. And then I think that links back to this extraction question, which is that I think I'm trustworthy when it comes to this content, right? But then convincing people to go out of their way and trust me if I have nothing to give back towards that trust doesn't seem like the best approach. Canan, maybe you have experience as doing things as an independent researcher. Is that a different?
Yeah, I have experiences both being as an institutionalized researcher back then and now as an independent researcher. When I was institutionalized, it was like my principle was that I never store the data on the university servers. So I never share the data with the university itself. The data belongs to the community or to the individuals with whom I spoke, and the raw data stored, and that's it. And I always made that clear from the start to the participants, of course. The second thing I did was to make sure that when I was in university, make sure that not everything we talked about would be part of the data, the official data. That's what I made sure. So I tried to ensure some opacity to participants or to the community itself. And I did that sometimes by having some moderators during focus groups so that they can take notes. They are from the community, they can take notes, but I won't have that notes on my computer or anything. We will be just discussing those things. And that would just give me an opportunity to conduct my analysis in a reflexive way. Or I would take my own notes and share those notes only with participants, but not store them on any university server, etc. And now that I'm independent researcher, I still follow similar codes. First of all, I never store the raw data from my computer in my computer because that's also a problematic issue on my part on the research that I'm doing. I can't really compromise the participants' identities. The second is that I'm trying to rebalance the power dynamic in a way that first of all I'm trying to do the research with communities in which I'm already tied to somehow. That's the first thing that I try to follow as a principle. The second thing is that I first produce community reports before any kind of academic productions. I produce. It can be really vague. It can be only preliminary analysis, but doesn't matter. I first produce a community report and I share it with the participants, and I stay in contact with participants most of the time for personal needs, for daily communications. So that's also part of my commitment and part of the trust building.
Thank you so much, John. All right, folks, I should be closing this. We're 90 minutes in. Thank you so much for all of you for coming. Thanks to those who shared methods, ideas, but also those who shared anxieties. a very good space to share anxieties. It's really good to see all of you. We'll be continuing this for the next year. I'm gonna send a link where you can find our schedule. You're probably all on our mailing list, but if not, you can send us a request through the contact form on the blog. So we add you to that so you can get our regular announcements. I think that's all. Fouad, Shannon, am I missing anything?
I feel like we can make this format a recurring one. It seems like there's a lot of things to discuss, and we need a lot more time. And we don't have this conversation in any other forum in any kind of regular way. So let's think about maybe doing this in a more consistent way somehow.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Thank you everyone for your time, for your labor. Have a nice rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.